Hi, everyone. We have scheduled a bonus episode of the show to bring you a very timely interview. My guest today is Kica Matos. She is president of the National Immigration Law Center and the Immigrant Justice Fund. She has experience as an advocate, as a community organizer, and as a lawyer. And she's here to talk to us about what's going on in LA, what's going on with ICE more broadly, and what the president is claiming to have powers to do here. And maybe what anybody can do about it. So, Kica, thank you so much for being available on short notice on a day when I imagine you are quite busy.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm really glad that we're having this conversation.
Me too. Before we get into the law and all these bigger topics that are technical, I wonder, as somebody who's worked in this space for a long time, if you would just share with us your emotional response to seeing what's happening in Los Angeles, to seeing what's happening with these careless and arbitrary deportations in our country.
I'm trying to catch my breath here. I will start off by saying that I have been doing immigration work now for 2 decades, and I have never seen what is happening in this country ever before. People are disappearing on our streets. Randomly, people are being picked up. They're being taken to detention centers, some of them never to be seen or heard from again until they call their loved ones from another country saying, I have been deported. Their ICE has been terrorizing communities all over the country, including in my own community. Just last week, for example, a young man and his father were picked up by ICE. He is scheduled to graduate from high school this week. He will not be at his graduation because right now he's in a detention center in Texas. The level of lawlessness and unconstitutional actions that are taking place under this guise of taking care of this immigration issue is horrifying. And what I have been saying to people is that we should all be concerned, because I truly believe that the path to authoritarianism in this country right now is being built on the backs of immigrants. They are starting with immigrants, but they will not end with immigrants. Eventually, they're going to come after all of us. But right now, what we are seeing is this effort to try to round up thousands and thousands of people every day in our communities with no respect for their constitutional rights. It's horrifying.
Let me talk about that for a moment. And I first want to endorse and underscore what you've said. We've seen this throughout history, that when authoritarian powers rise, they target the least powerful to sort of attest their ability, whether it was gypsies or Jewish people in Germany or ethnic minorities in other countries. And you can argue that that's exactly what's happening here. It's a template that they could be used again. Without getting into detail on this, can you give us just a quick snapshot of some of the things that they're doing that are unlawful? And I just want to say, I get response from people saying, look, it's very upsetting to see what they're doing. But the truth is, people come in illegally. They don't have papers. They're just enforcing the law. Let's put aside for a moment how hard it is to get papers, even if you're a faithfully hardworking person. What is ICE doing that is unlawful right now?
So let me just start off by saying something very basic that I think very many Americans don't understand, which is that undocumented immigrants also have the rights to constitutional protections, right? The Constitution does not just apply to U.S. citizens. So in constitutional legal terms, what are the things that are happening right now that are unconstitutional? First, due process is being undermined. Equal protection of the laws are being undermined. Let me break it down in very plain English. What is happening right now is that ICE is, for example, going into people's homes without warrants. Fourth Amendment, right? Very basic. The Fourth Amendment protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. And they're pretextually getting access into people's homes. They're breaking into people's homes. Right now, they are asserting that under the Alien Enemies Act, they have the right to enter people's homes for people who are from Venezuela without a warrant. So that's the first thing. Under the ruse, a bunch of ruses, they are entering people's homes without warrants. They're taking people away right? Without any due process either. People are being snatched off the streets. Officers are refusing to identify themselves. They don't give any information about who they are. They're giving no information about the basis for their arrest. They're engaging also in racial profiling. Again, something illegal. They are randomly picking people off the street that look like me. Again, with no respect for people's constitutional rights. So those are some examples of what we are seeing on the ground. But here's something else that people don't know. The people who are being affected are not just undocumented immigrants. U.S. citizens have also been caught up in this dragnet. Why? Because ICE is trying to meet these crazy quotas that the administration has imposed, right? Every field office is supposed to arrest 3,000 people every day. And so in this fit of hysteria and this effort to try to meet their quotas, they are grabbing as many brown and black people as they can, including U.S. citizens. I can give you two quick examples. One in Newark, there was a raid of a seafood company. Among the people who were detained were a Puerto Rican veteran. Somebody who fought for this country was detained. Why? Because he's Puerto Rican and he looked Latino. There was a family in Wisconsin in the mall speaking Spanish, and they were detained by ICE and taken to a detention center. And that's when they discovered that this family was Puerto Rican. The reason they were detained is because they, like me, were brown and they spoke Spanish.
I've heard so many stories like this. Thank you for sharing that snapshot of what's happening in our country right now. So many people aren't aware of it. I want to get to what's happening in LA, but let me stay on deportations for one more moment because this is important. A lot of places, we're watching videos on social media of people doing these removals, grabbing people who don't look like law enforcement. They are not disciplined. They're wearing sloppy clothes. They seem to just be random people enlisted to snatch other people off the street. I've heard about something called 287 that lets sheriff's offices participate with ICE. You can say no, but do you have any visibility into who ICE is enlisting to do some of this work?
They are enlisting as many enforcement authorities as they can. So yes, 287G is an agreement that state law enforcement can sign with the federal government, authorizing state law enforcement to assist in carrying out immigration enforcement. But what the Department of Homeland Security has also done is, for example, they've reached out to the IRS to ask them for 2,000 of their officers to start carrying out enforcement. They've reached out to the DEA. They've reached out to the FBI. Yes. They've reached out to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. So they are trying to build out this enforcement force using other federal enforcement agencies as well as states that are willing to engage in these kinds of shenanigans.
Okay, so for folks listening, I learned about this in the last Trump administration. Almost every agency in government has its own mini police force, and that's what you're talking about. When you see them say federal police were deployed somewhere in LA, that can be a police force that works with DHS, works with any of these entities, and I guess the IRS too. Thank you for that clarification.
Okay.
Okay, let's turn to Los Angeles. So let's start with the news. The president is reportedly going to deploy 700 Marines in LA. I haven't confirmed this, but it's from several very reputable news organizations before we started live. They have multiple sources saying this. Under what authority can the president do this?
That is a really good question, and we're trying to get under the hood on that. But let me start off by saying that his first efforts to try to deploy the National Guard over the weekend relied on this arcane legal authority, US 10-12406, that we had never heard of. Right? Our lawyers at the National Immigration Law Center right now are looking into that very question, under what authority is he intending? Because we have heard the same rumors as well that he's planning to deploy Marines to Los Angeles. What we should be concerned about as we watch this unfold is the language that the administration is using about what is happening in LA. And let me just quickly draw a contrast, right? January 6th, what we saw was an insurrection happening a few years ago. right? That really fit the very definition of an insurrection. We did not once hear President Trump talk about an insurrection or looking to mobilize the National Guards to put down this insurrection. Fast forward to this last weekend, there were protests in LA, mostly peaceful protests, because immigrant family members and allies were shocked and horrified over the use of force targeting undocumented immigrants. And let me just be clear that the people that they were going after in LA are not so-called violent criminals. I know they use that language often, right? These were people who were sought after because the government alleges that they were undocumented, right? People without status. That is the basis for these arrests, right? Most of the protests in LA were peaceful. There were a few folks that got a little out of control, and all of a sudden we've seen this language of an insurrection happening.
I'll
So
add, they
yeah, go
arrested
ahead.
56 protesters. Tens
Yes.
of thousands, maybe 100,000 or more people show up, 56 arrests to just
And they
give
were
the lie to
dressed,
Trump's claim. Yeah.
yes, and they were dressed in military fatigues, which is something that activists in LA had also not seen. They were dressed like they were going to go after terrorists or in the middle of a terrible war, right? So I want to point out the hypocrisy first, but the other thing that I want to really point out to you, to share with you and to point out to the audience is that this language of insurrection is not accidental. What we should expect, unless all of us speak out, is that in the not too distant future, this administration is going to invoke the Insurrection Act. Why should we be concerned about that? Because the Insurrection Act will then authorize this administration to allow the military to begin to engage in civilian enforcement in our country, in our democracy. So I'm going to break it down for folks in this audience. That means that if you have neighbors who are immigrants, it may be entirely possible in the not too distant future that you will see military jeeps rolling up in your neighborhood, breaking down the doors of your neighbors to take them away. Why? Because they are suspected of being undocumented in this country. And that is where we are heading, and that's why we should all be concerned.
Trump is, in fact, said that in his proclamation, or whatever you call it, a directive, when we didn't talk about this yet, but he federalized the California National Guard, and he federalized them against the wishes of the governor, invoking this thing you talked about, Armed Services, Article 10 or whatever. And in the language of that directive, it was not specific to California, apparently. And so Governor Newsom said, "This now, if you let it happen in California, it could happen in any state." I'm curious, the governor of California, we're now talking about the deployment of National Guard in California already in the ground against the governor's will. The governor usually is the one who deploys these guardsmen. I think the last time a president did this was 1996 for the LA riots. Question for you is, the state of California is suing to the Supreme Court over this. What are the kind of legal arguments at play in this case, which is a states' rights versus federal rights issue?
So my understanding, and I haven't seen the pleadings yet because they haven't been filed, but my understanding is that part of the argument that California is making is that this is a violation of the 10th Amendment, which really focuses on commandeering. And commandeering is a very simple premise that the federal government cannot compel the state or local government to implement or enforce federal laws or regulations. And so the state of California is asserting that that is exactly what happened. And I just want to point out, and I know this is a bit of a detail, but I want to really underscore the importance of this, which is that this is the first time since and I have it written here, this is the first time since 1965, right, that the National Guard has been deployed against the wishes of a governor. Then, right, it was to enforce civil rights laws, right, in Selma. And now what we're finding is exactly the reverse is happening, right? In order to squash people's civil rights, we now have an administration that has chosen to ignore the wishes of the government of California and, in essence, tapped into their National Guard and sent them out to California to protect ICE.
And that is an important point, which is they're not allowed to protect people. They're there to protect the ICE agents and the buildings,
Yes.
not the citizens.
No.
They're protecting those entities from the citizens, which is wild.
And the order was very specific. It's to protect government property and personnel.
Would you explain to us why, if somebody were to say at our dinner table, well, why shouldn't the military come and remove people who are undocumented? They're undocumented. They're not here legally, so the military should do this. How would you have that discussion at the dinner table?
That is so antithetical to any democracy. What I would say to that person at the dinner table is that they are endorsing a dictatorship. Right? What do we see in dictatorships? We see military takeovers. We see the suspension of constitutions. We see the curtailment of people's civil rights. One of the things that is so sacred in our democracy, right, is that we have elected leaders by the people, for the people. So even if you feel some kind of way about undocumented immigrants, you should care enough about what's happening to think about this in the context of the need to protect our democracy. Because there will be no putting a genie back into this bottle if we continue to go down this path of authoritarianism. They are targeting immigrants right now, but as we have seen in other authoritarian regimes, and as you said, they will move on to other unpopular people who do not agree with this administration, and all of us will lose our rights and our liberties. And that should concern all of us. It doesn't matter who you vote for. It doesn't matter what your political orientation is. If we love this country and we love our democracy, we should care about it enough to be concerned about what's happening in our country right now.
Can you tell us anything about the conditions in some of the detention centers? Do you know?
Yeah. No, I've been to some of these detention centers. They're pretty deplorable. You know, we call them detention centers. They're prisons, they're jails. People have very little mobility. They have very little liberties. The food, and then these are private. Some of these private detention facilities, at the end of the day, they're all about making money. And so the budgets that they direct, for example, making sure that people are adequately fed or are adequately taken care of, is very low. Because at the end of the day, they're making money on the backs of immigrants. Now, what I understand from some colleagues in LA is that so the administration claims that there were only 44 people who were detained. Our allies tell us that it was closer to 80 people who were detained. And as I understand it, they were put in the basement of a detention center under very substandard conditions. We know also that some Customs and Border Patrol facilities, and we saw it under Trump 1.0, the conditions are terrible and there's a lot of overcrowding. And some people that were taken from the detention center in LA were then taken to other detention centers before they were deported. These are not places that anyone wants to spend any significant amount of time in. They're mostly really horrible and really depressing and very sad.
I understand David Huerta, the leader of the SEIU labor union, I think the West Coast branch, had been detained. He was as a peaceful observer at a protest or at some detainments, and he got arrested. He was injured. What's his status?
Thankfully, he was recently released on bond, and I just want to be really clear about what David was doing. David is a leader for, like you said, the SEIU, which is I believe the nation's largest labor union. When he heard about what was happening, these raids that were taking place, he actually went there with the intention of reminding the workers that were impacted about their rights. That is what he was doing. There's been a lot of training that all of us have engaged in to remind people about their constitutional rights. So if ICE grabs you, remember the do's and don'ts. And so he went there to remind people, and I don't know if you saw the video, but he was pushed down by ICE. His head was pushed into the sidewalk. He ended up going to the hospital. He was arrested and detained, went to the hospital, and then they detained him over the weekend. And there was a hearing just a few hours ago, and he was released on bond. I believe the bond was
And he's a full
$50,000.
U.S. citizen. There's like no reason for this whatsoever. Yeah.
He is a person who has risen the ranks of SEIU because of his leadership abilities, and he's somebody that we should all look up to and be thankful for.
I don't want to take too much of your time, but I do want to. Maybe we can do this again, and I can ask you some other questions. But can you
Sure.
quickly tell us? Do you know some of those do's and don'ts we can share with people?
Yes, I'm always reminded, right? You have, and I know you should first. You always want to ask in any place where somebody asks, if you're walking down the street and somebody that looks like they're a ICE agent or a police officer or something, and they start asking you questions, and first you don't have to say anything, right? You can say, I'm not going to answer your questions. You also want to ask, am I free to leave?
Oh, that's good.
Right? Because that indicates to the officer first that you know your rights, right? And unless you're being detained, you are free to leave. If ICE comes and knocks on your door, right, ask for a judicial warrant. Sometimes ICE will say, we're looking for so-and-so, and here's a warrant, right? And it's not a judicial warrant signed by a judge. What they're showing you is an administrative warrant, which is basically permission from an ICE officer to this person to be able to carry out their enforcement activity. If your name isn't there and it's not signed by a judge, you can say, I do not consent to let you into my house. Right. So our tendency, I think we get nervous. We're like, oh, let them in. Once you let an ICE officer into your home, all bets are off because you are consenting to them coming into your household. But you always want to remember that the less you say, the better off you are. Now, some people who are U.S. citizens, right? If you don't want to go through if you exercise your rights that way, what will inevitably happen is that they will take you away somewhere, right? And it'll be a headache, right? But that's the agency that you choose. You either fight for your rights. You could also, if you're a U.S. citizen, just show them your ID. For those who are observing, you have the right to record what you see as long as you do not get in the way of enforcement. So I encourage people, if you see something that is really awful, right, and you can record it and make the argument that you are not getting in the way of enforcement, you should do so.
So if they say, stop that, you're in my way, just back off.
Exactly.
And keep recording.
Yeah.
And are you allowed to ask for their name and badge or anything like that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have been doing Know Your Rights training, and we say the first thing you should ask is, what is your name? What is your badge number? And under what authority am I free to leave? And if they say no, then under what authority am I being arrested?
And an observer can also ask that. They don't have to answer it maybe, but you could ask, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. I would love to ask, is there any authority under which Trump could arrest Newsom? I mean, he's making things up, but within the limits of the existing law, not bending the law. He can't really, this is just a bluff.
Well, Holman over the weekend was running his mouth on Fox News, saying how much he wanted to arrest the mayor of LA, Karen Bass, and he was using language of obstruction of our officers, the whole notion that impeding, right, in the course of their carrying out the law enforcement activities, they engaged in activities that were obstructing the right of these officers to engage in enforcement. So that is entirely the train of thought and the line of thinking that they're engaging in. But given how they have rolled out all of these arcane laws to be able to facilitate authoritarianism, I am sure there are a bunch of lawyers who are right now in their computers trying to figure out ways that they can continue to destroy our democracy and intimidate and harass people, including governors.
Okay, it's a lot. May I ask you, what can those of us who are not being targeted do in general?
You want to make sure that you are reaching out to your member of Congress. By the way, this bill, the reconciliation bill, has $150 billion set aside for this kind of enforcement that we're seeing in LA. You want to also make sure that if you can, reach out to your immigrant neighbors, give them the red card. If you go on the computer, there are these little red cards that are about people's constitutional rights, right? Share it with them. Make sure that people in your community have access to those little red cards. For those who can volunteer to run errands for immigrant families that are too afraid to go to the supermarket,
Oh, how do
right?
we
There's
do
people
that?
who
Are there organizations
their
organizing that?
organization. Yes. So what you want to do is go online and find an immigrant rights organization in your community and sign up. You can also join protests. There are a lot of protests happening right now, and there are also people who are offering to provide any help and support to immigrant families that have been impacted by enforcement. So there are very many ways for people to help immigrants. And then the last thing I will say, right, we have to speak up for our democracy in whatever way we can right now. Because if we don't, right, it will be too late. And I think this administration is relying on us to be complicit and silent as they quickly try to erode our democracy.
And people can support your work at the National Immigration Law Center.
Immigration Law Center. Yes, check out our website. We do a ton of work. Sign up, join us, support us. Everybody needs to, I beg people, I've been cajoling people, step it up and fight for our democracy because we need everybody now.
Kica Matos, thank you so much for what you're doing and for spending your time with us today to explain this. I would love to do this again. I don't think this story's going anywhere.
I
So,
would love to be back. Thank you so much for
right.
inviting me.
Thank you very much. We'll be in
Take
touch.
care.
So, uh, what a I'm so grateful to her to be available today for this. I will share this, of course, and also get back to you. That is the first time I have heard that there are systems set up to buy groceries on behalf of folks who cannot leave their house. So I'm going to work on finding information out about that and share that with you. I'm also going to continue covering the protests and the Marines coming to my city and everything that's happening. Please let me know what are your questions. And definitely check out today's newsletter. I think it was an important one, and I share some of my own observations as a journalist who's covered protests and riots, how important it is to understand that so much of the coverage of this is getting it wrong. It is wildly placid. There are spots of people who are aggressive and agitators, but overall, there's tens of thousands, maybe more, hundreds of thousands people who turned out. I don't know the count right now, but 56 were arrested. That's how limited the real unrest was. And now the president is using it as a pretext to bring out, I'm looking at images on cable news right now. I mean, the most heavily armed force imaginable on the homeland. It's the sort of thing that other presidents do as with, a tremor and with a heavy heart and as a very last resort when they see no other option. It is not the sort of thing that is done casually as this president is. And I worry for my city and for the country if this is allowed to continue. So I'm going to stay on this story quite diligently in the coming days. So so keep tuning in and send me your questions. And thank you for being here today. See you soon.